Godsong, Sita and Gita, we have Amit Majmudar in conversation with James Mallinson. So let's welcome Amit Majmudar and James Mallinson on stage for the last session. I don't want to say it. Godsong, Sita and Gita.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for running such a tight ship. So it gives me great pleasure to be talking to Amit Majmudar today. He's a tricky person to introduce because there's so many things one can say about him. He's a nuclear radiologist. I thought he was a radiologist. He corrected me earlier, said he's a nuclear radiologist. And of course, we're talking about the Gita today. And so I suddenly thinking about it afterwards. I thought that really brings to mind the old Robert Oppenheimer quote, you know, the famous one when he witnessed the first atomic bomb. But don't worry, actually I wrote it down, I did look it up exactly, what was it? Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. But we've got a much more life-affirming talk for you today, I hope, because he's done these two, he's done numerous books, poetry, anthologies, novels, but today we're going to be talking about his Sitayana, which is a retelling of the Ramayana, and also Godsong, which is his translation of the Gita. Godsong came out about a year ago, a bit less than a year ago.
In March of 20.
And Sitayana is 2 days hot off the press or something.
4 days.
4 days, 4 days, sorry. So it's very fresh. Probably perhaps the freshest book here, who knows. So I've got a few questions lined up, first of all. We're going to talk about the Sitayana first, I think. And I've got so many questions, actually. There's no way I'm going to be able to ask them all. So I'll try and leave a bit of time at the end for some questions. First of all, with the Sitayana, now, of course, there have been numerous retellings of the Ramayana. What prompted you to do this one, and what makes it different from other retellings?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you, James, for that wonderful introduction. And I could spend the rest of our session introducing James right back. It's really an honor, first of all, to be here, and an honor to talk to you. For the Sitayana, kind of my labor of love recently, being a poet, a Hindu poet, a poet in the Hindu tradition, it's really a pleasure to be part of this parampara of poets who have told the story of the Ramayana since Adikavi Valmiki, through Kampan, through Tulsidas, and really I think, truly innumerable poets in the vernacular languages of India, and the other writers in English who have retold the Ramayana. And at the same time, when you're in that dynasty and when you're doing work that has so many people doing the same thing, and where the audience knows the story already, you do have to find a way to kind of set yourself apart and give the reader something that they may not get somewhere else. And in the case of the Sitayana, I wanted to bring to it two things that I felt that I could bring. And one of the things is that, I've spent the past, I guess, quarter of a century trying to refine my poetic craft. So I thought that I could bring linguistic beauty to it in the telling itself, at the level of the sentence, at the level of the phrase, at the level of the image. But when it really comes down to the story, you are above all a storyteller, and you have to be faithful to the story. So I wanted to tell the story in a way that held the true and original nature of the characters sacred. I didn't want to violate the story and have Sita kind of sort of like Ravan, or have, Lakshman be jealous that Ram has his wife in exile and he doesn't. All those things I find repulsive. And so I wanted to be, first of all, absolutely true to the original story. And I wanted to tell it in a new way, in a way that would be different than any other way that it's begun. And so in the beginning, the story, Sitayana itself, is told, every chapter is told from a different character's perspective. And not only do I change the perspective from chapter to chapter, I structure the narrative itself so that you begin by thinking that it's Sita telling her own story from the beginning. Oh, when I was a girl, it was like this. But then at the end of that first chapter in Sita's voice, you discover that she's actually trapped in the Ashok Vartika, reminiscing about her childhood. And the very next thing that happens is Mandodari comes to meet her And then after that, she has her encounter with Hanuman, who then tells her how he leapt from all the way across the sea to Lanka. So in that way, the rest of the book has a forward momentum from that moment, from that encounter between Hanuman and Sita, and every character in some way fills in the backstory of how Sita ended up in the Ashok Vatika.
So in terms of the structure of the book, then have you drawn from your craft as a novelist as well?
Right, and I think the as far as voice is concerned, as far as structuring the story is concerned, those are a lot of like contemporary novelistic techniques that aren't actually in the more linear framework of the older epic retellings.
It'd be good to hear a bit of one of those voices. I think maybe you've got something teed up for us. That'd be great.
Yeah. I'll just read the first two paragraphs because I know we have a lot of questions. I'll just read the first two paragraphs. This is just chapter 1 in Sita's voice. She's just reminiscing. Remember, she's in the Ashok Vatika. You don't know that yet, but she's reminiscing about her childhood. Growing up, I used to walk on my hands a lot. As soon as my feet left the last palace steps and I stood on unmediated earth, I would pitch forward and continue strolling upside down. My leaf-littered, comb-snagging hair swept my handprints as I went. Tutors, regal aunts, and governesses, I required 4, 1 for each cardinal direction I might run off in, squealed in despair. The chase was on as crisp saris ran after my little legs, all splotchy with play bruises. When I let myself get caught, they hustled me off to the bath. They tried to scrub the brown off my skin. My father didn't mind my midsummer sun stain, nut-brown cheeks, dirt-brown arms and nape. He ordered a sandbox to be made for me, but had it filled with topsoil instead. I was his foundling girl, and dirty was how he found me, after all, in a furrow, churned up by the plow like an ancient coin. Thank you.
I like that, the play bruises. That has a kind of Sanskrit ring to it. That's the sort of thing you might hear in a Sanskrit compound.
Yeah, exactly, the compounding.
Now, of course, not only you bringing some of your novelist craft, which I'm sure is influenced by contemporary novel writing, but also that you're bringing a feminist perspective to the book by presenting some of it, this first chapter from Sita's point of view, and of course that's clear in the title of the book, Sitayana. Yours is not the first one, is it? The recent years, I suppose, with the sort of feminist turn, have seen a few other retellings from a feminist angle of the story. So, is there anything? I don't know if you've read those other ones, but do you feel that yours is a different? You've taken a different approach to them in any way?
Right. I think that. I haven't read everything. I haven't read all the Ramayanas out there, but I know that for the Sitayana, I wanted it to be something, that could be construed as feminist, but I wanted the feminism of the Sitayana to come from within the Hindu tradition. And I think that when a lot of times when we talk about feminism and the way feminism has originated on Western university campuses, first wave, second wave, third wave, it is something that opposes the sexes. So there's a battle of the sexes, and it sets males and females in opposition. And there's some rationale behind that. I'm not questioning that ideology. But with the Sitayana, I wanted to get back to certain rooted principles that are rooted in some of the earliest history of the Hindu Dharma, which is that there's Shiva and Shakti means power, and the male and the female principles. In fact, the female is the active principle, and the male and the female are actually. They are together, and they are one integrated being. And there are even, you can find beautiful renditions of Ardhanara Eshwara in your art museums from classical times. And so at the end of the Sitayana, in the sort of climactic battle between Ram and Ravan, I actually have it. It's actually narrated from Indra's perspective, because remember, Ravan and Ravan's son both fought and bested Indra, so he has a vested interest in watching Ravan get his comeuppance. So what I do at that point in the narrative is I actually have Ravan temporarily gets the better of Ram, and he does that by sort of crushing him under the Pushpak Viman, which is his aerial chariot. And they are separated. The battle is now, they've crash landed, and the battle is taking place on the other side of the wall of the Ashok Vartika, and Sita's on the other side of it, and she knows that Rama is in distress. And so what I have happen is that because she's the daughter of the earth, and she has this connection to the earth, I have her infuse Ram through the earth with her Shakti. And that is, in the book, that is what gives Sri Ram his characteristic green color, which he has in all the artistic representations. And then she is his she becomes his Shakti. She empowers him to fling off the Pushpak Viman and actually fight and slay Ravan. So that's kind of how I incorporated a feminist angle into it, but I rooted it in the Hindu tradition.
Very nice. So did you want to? Did you have a section
to
read on that as well?
Sure. It's a very brief passage that I'll just read you, so you can see how I make that happen, dramatically speaking. Remember, this is Indra. Indra at first is narrating this part of the Sitayana because he's been watching the battle. Sita, on the other side of the wall, can hear Ravana's several internal monologues. She can infer that her husband needs her help. The Rakshasis step back as her body, lying face down in despair, floats upright without so much as a bend of the knees. Her spreading oil spill of wild black hair starts to lengthen and dive into the soil. Her toenails, too, curl and engage root-like with the soil. Her cuticles tinge green, and inexplicable orchids open behind her ears, though she never placed any in her hair. Rama, she screams, her body racked with shudders, her feet flexing. Rama! Ravan turns in irritation to the wall. Get her away from here! The wardens won't dare touch Sita in this fit. Rama! Rama! Shut that woman up! Ravan doesn't see the pushpak shift behind him. By the time the chariot tumbleweeds aside, it is too late. Rama, empowered, spins through the air with his sword in both hands. He plants his feet. He strikes.
Lovely. So there, I believe you've introduced that. That's from your imaginative creation.
Right. And I think that if you look back over all the Ramayans that have been written, I think that every poet tells a story and then adds something to the story of their own. And I wanted that to be one thing that I kind of added on my own. You want to take liberties to a certain extent as long as they're faithful. At least that's my philosophy on it. Like, I want there to be fidelity in translation as well. Fidelity is very important because in Latin, the Latin root of fidelity is actually faith.
So there you've kind of introduced some of your own take on it, a feminist spin, we might say, on that part of the story. Now, of course, if one's looking at the Ramayana, there's the sort of most controversial aspect of it from the Uttarakhand of the Agni Pariksha. Right. And I'm wondering how, if you're bringing to some extent a feminist perspective to this retelling of the tale, how have you dealt with that?
Oh, well, first of all, I kept the Uttarakhand as it is. I did not alter what is in it, even though it's controversial, even though it may make some readers think, hey, what's going on with Rama? Why is he doing this? And I believe that's because I believe that the Uttarakhand is one of the keys to the Ramayana as a whole and to the nature of Ram as a whole. And so what I have, in the Sitayana, I have the fundamental principle being that Rama and Sita love each other. and they love each other completely, no matter how messily everything ended, right? And things did not end happily ever after, because, you know, what kind of stories do end happily ever after? Well, fairy tales end happily ever after, and the Ramayana is not a fairy tale. It's epic. It is an epic. And if you look at the Iliad ends with the most sympathetic character in the epic, Hector, the Trojan warrior Hector. He's slain and he's dragged through the dirt behind the chariot of Achilles. And the Ramayana ends just as catastrophically. There's this moment where, you know, Ram and Sita could be reunited after this second exile that Sita has been sent to, but she decides that she wants to return to the earth and return to the lap of her mother the earth. And I kept all that intact because I believe that messy sort of non-fairy tale ending is catnip to a novelist. And it is something that makes the story human and not like a fairy tale, but recognizable, because we know situations where people can love each other and the relationship still won't work out, you know? And at the same time, I'm drawn to the Uttarkand because it has this, it makes Rama more enigmatic. Suddenly, we see Ram in a position where he's torn. He's not certain what to do, and when he makes his decision, it hurts him. So in those days, you know, kings could take multiple wives. People urged him to remarry. But in that final sacrifice that they're doing in Ayodhya, he has a golden statue of Sita placed next to him because he misses her so much. And meanwhile, Sita, on her end, she teaches Rama's story. She doesn't teach the Sitayana, she teaches the Ramayana, right, to her sons, to her twin sons, and to her and Rama's sons. And that enigmatic nature of Ram at the end, that where you just can't quite penetrate his thought. And at the same time, what he did to Sita could be construed by anyone as being cruel because she was pregnant with twins. And I'm a father of twins, so I remember what my wife was like at that point. It could be construed as cruel. But I think that theologically speaking, there's something, just as the Uttarkand makes Ram fully human, it also makes him fully divine. Because if you look at all these ancient religious traditions, they were very unsentimental about the nature of the divine. So in the book of Job, the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Old Testament, he makes a wager with the devil about this pious man Job, and he tells the devil, you can do whatever you like to Job, and we'll see if he curses me or not. And in the Gita also, in the 11th Adhyaya, the Vishwarup Darshan, where Arjuna is being granted this sublime vision that that Krishna himself says you can't get it by studying the Vedas, you can't do it by austerities or anything like that. This is a personal gift or favor that Arjuna is getting. He sees signs and he sees these wonderful shapes and everything, but by the end of it, he begs Krishna to stop it and pack it all up because he sees things that scare him to his core. And that's sort of seeing like the dark side of the moon. And the Uttarkand contains all of this. And so it's controversial, I know, but I kept it exactly as it was. I didn't alter any of those incidents or any of that ambiguity or any of that darkness.
Great. Well, thank you. I suppose the divine can be cruel, and you keeping that in, to remove that would be to massively alter the way that the story goes. Well, I think that we're going to move on now from the Sitayana to the Bhagavad Gita. It says in your oeuvre, your now growing, voluminous oeuvre of publications, it stands out as being somewhat different in that it's a translation of a Sanskrit text, whereas everything else is your own creative imagination, really. Can you tell us how that came about? Why the Gita? Why have you chosen to translate it?
Well, first and foremost, I believe it's the truth. And I believe it's the truth in a way that other books don't contain the truth. There are books of facts, and there are books of great ideas, and there's all sorts of wonderful books out there. But the Gita has always stood out for me because I believe it's the truth. And I believe that what it says about human nature is the truth. I believe that what it says about the divine, what it says about ethics, what it says about human personality, and what it says about how to get there, Gyan, Karma, Bhakti, I believe those things are true. And I've always wanted, and I've started reading it when I was in my teens, several different translations. I read many different translations. And I always felt like I was skating on the surface of it. And all the ideas were very attractive to me, but I never felt like I could fully understand it. And so when you have this translation, it implies that I did it for all of you, and I did do it for all of you. But I think that my primary motive was actually self-serving or self-transfiguring, which is that I wanted to understand it better. And the only way that I could understand it, even to the degree that I've understood it so far, was to go and engage with it on a word-by-word basis, to spend all of the time and the concentration trying to apply the skills that I had acquired as a poet over many years to trying to create this kind of work, to create this translation. And at the same time, going back to the idea of the parampara, I believe that there's a reason that this dharma is sanatan and is eternal, and that's because of individuals. It's nothing intrinsic in it. It's because of individuals, and it is the greatest honor possible for a poet, greater than the Nobel Prize, greater than the Pulitzer Prize, any of those awards or anything like that. It's a far greater honor for me as a poet to be able to be counted among those people who are born in every generation, who devoted their ability to perpetuating this dharma. Because it's going to happen with me or without me. I know that. I have faith in that. It will continue with me or without me, but I want it to continue with me. And I want, I want to be able to report to whatever authority I encounter after my passing that I did my part. I carried the torch.
Thanks. It's connected with that question, so I can understand how you've explained why, coming from you personally, the Gita is a text that means a great deal to you, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that and why you wanted to work on it. But I recently, there's a rather good biography of the Gita. The Gita is such an important book that it has its own biographies written about it, and I think it's Richard Davis, isn't it?
Richard Davis,
yeah,
yes.
Who wrote this biography. It's a rather good book, and I checked it out. I remember the stats, and apparently there have been 1,891 translations into 75 different languages and 273 into English. So
274 now.
Yeah, sorry, 274. I have to update. Well, actually, and also that stat comes from 1982, so who knows what's happened.
Clearly over 300
Probably
now,
300 by now. So I'm afraid I have to ask you the question of why yours? What are you bringing to it that you think others won't?
I'd like to say, first of all, that I've read a lot of translations, and I think that everyone brings something different to their translation, some other virtue that they have. No translation, not mine, not I believe anyone else's, can match the original. We know that. We know that's the case, and I think that holds true not just of the Gita, but of most works of poetry, period. They say that poetry is untranslatable. But translations of the Gita often fall into one of two categories. One is, it'll be done by, a swami or some enlightened figure, the head of a panth or a sanstha or something, and English may not necessarily be their first or second or even third language. They're multilingual, and they don't have a grounding in the English literary tradition, which is something that I feel is necessary to truly write well in English poetry, Other translations will sometimes be done by scholars, some, fantastically superior Sanskritists, certainly superior to me, who will not be interested in bringing across the poetic beauty of it. And to be honest with you, I had no idea just how poetically beautiful and poetically charged the Gita is and how consummately a poem it is until I engaged with the original, because I'd read so many translations that didn't really care about it. They cared about the ideas, and I love that they cared about the ideas. But the Gita is simultaneously to me, it's the pinnacle of human poetic art. Why do I say that? Well, if you think about it, it's simultaneously a dramatic poem, a narrative poem, a didactic poem, and a lyric poem. It's every type of poem at the same time, right? It has more than one meter, which it modulates exquisitely. So in the Vishwarup Darshan, when Krishna expands, the verse expands to the Trishtubh meter, right? It's brilliant. And there are little touches everywhere, some of which I tried to replicate. So in the 11th adhyaya, when Arjuna begins to address the Vishwarup Darshan, he stutters. And so what does the line do? The line stutters. It says, Sagadgadam bhita bhita pranamya, right? It's just flooringly brilliant. And if it was a poet, I would say, bravo, chapeau, you know? And so, I mean, I tried to replicate. It's very hard to replicate these things in English and still stay faithful. So, you know, I said, you know, in a terror-struck stutter, you know, so I stuttered the, you know, so I made the line halt and halt in the way the original halts, you know. But the original is obviously superior, as it always is, right? Because he actually makes two syllables replicate in quick succession, right? And so that's the sort of thing I bring to it as a practicing poet. Whenever there's anaphora, for example, which is a rhetorical device where everything will begin with the same, every phrase will begin with the same word, aneka, this, that, the other, many, right? I replicate that. I replicate those words in the same positions that they're in the original. And I can do that because I've just been practicing that for so long, you know?
No, I can vouch for that. I mean, I've translated many Sanskrit texts, lots of published books of translations of verse and yoga texts and so forth. I'm a Sanskrit teacher at a university. I've been studying Sanskrit for 30 years. So I have to confess, I was somewhat skeptical when I heard about Amit, you know, the nuclear radiologist who just decided to pick up Sanskrit in the evening. So I have to confess to slightly casting a sort of, you know, as though I was looking at my undergraduate's work, and it's flawless, annoyingly, and very beautiful as well. And so I think he's done a fantastic job, actually, of not only introducing, reproducing the poetic flavor, but also the economy of language as well, which is one of Sanskrit's great characteristics.
That means a lot coming from a man like this.
But what I would still like to know is the process. You know, how on earth did you? You've obviously got an extremely demanding job.
Right.
So how did you fit this in, and how did you go about learning Sanskrit?
So as early as 2009 is when I first started working with the Gita, and the first thing I did was something called Prism of the Song, where I took the 10th and 11th adhyayas, and I had no Sanskrit at this point, and I sort of created these poems from each shloka, and that was sort of like a project, right? And I was doing this, and I realized that I was making a poem out of a translation. I wasn't making a poem out of the scripture, right? And so between that and my general sense of not knowing it as well as I wanted to, I knew that I wanted to pursue the original in some way or another. And my wife actually studied Sanskrit at UC Berkeley with Professor Goldman. She had her syllabi. There are many, actually, there's more than one book out there that you can teach yourself Sanskrit with. I used Coulson's, Coulson, and I got some understanding of the grammar to understand, you know, that's a locative and that's another locative, right? And then that's when the real work began, because I was not happy with simply finding out what the words meant from Sanskrit-English dictionaries, which, by the way, were very helpful throughout the process. Even some of the earlier British colonial ones, which I found very helpful, including Monier Williams and a few others. But for me, it was very much every word had to be its own project, and I had to basically study all the possibilities, exclude all the possibilities, and find the etymologies of the words that I could potentially use and see if they matched. And so sometimes I do a lot of work and it wouldn't really help. So gyan comes from a root word that also exists in Greek and is based in the word gnosis, but a jnani is not agnostic in English because gnostic means something thoroughly different. You can't use it, right? So in that case, I used the word mystic. So it was talking about sthita prajna. So I said steady mystic, right? And steady and sthita have a similar etymological background. Prajna, it has the root word from knowledge, but instead I used mystic, which has the Greek root word of secret, because the secret is what the knower knows, right? And those are the sort of games that I played, the sacred games that I played, and that it may sound tedious, and I understand that, but it wasn't. But I want to tell you that it did not feel tedious to me for a second. There was never a point where I was like, okay, I got to look up this one now, or oh, I got to get my resources out for this one. It was never tedious to me. It was a labor of love from beginning to end, and I spent years on it, but it illuminated a lot for me. And it was part of that very painstaking, slow-going process that helped me understand the Gita to the extent that I understand it. And I don't claim to be an enlightened knower of the field or knower of the Gita or anything like that. But that's really what helped me, and it made me wonder, and I was talking to Jim about this earlier, it made me wonder how well I understand anything I've ever read. Because the way that the Gita opened up through that process of doing dhyan on each word, and thinking so hard about each word, each phrase, and then each line, and then each shloka, and then its place in the adhyaya overall, it was a very humbling experience, because you can score very high on reading comprehension tests, but it's very possible that we're just skating over the surface of language as we experience it, and that was very humbling for me.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. It's the process of translation. You can often think you've understood something in Sanskrit or another language until you actually have to write down the translation, a translation you're prepared to show to others, and then you really, really have to understand it properly. And often, you realize that you haven't done so, and makes you work hard. Now, you've mentioned already, and I'd like you to expand upon this, because, of course, I come from a slightly different, well, I have a mixture of paramparas, but my scholarly parampara enforces me to look at the Gita in time. I'm through study of texts, I'm a cultural and religious historian, and so I also see the Gita in a particular context, which maybe I'll come on to later, I won't if we have time. But you've already mentioned, you've said that you think that the Gita has a universal message, and which I'm not disputing, that can shine through. But I would like
you could dispute it. I wouldn't mind it.
I agree totally. But I do see that message also situated within a certain historical moment. But I think it can apply now. But maybe you can expand upon what you see as that universal message.
I do believe also with you that the Gita's message is universal, and that it is applicable today just as it was to Prince Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. But I also believe that it's not as though I or anyone perhaps can tell each and every person in here, hey, look, this is how the Gita applies to you, right? Because no one knows you in your life as well as you know you in your life. And there may be a point where you engage with the Gita and it doesn't speak to you. And you think to yourself, this is just not for me. And I would encourage you to give it time and to go back to it. Because just like, there are novels that I've tried to read at one age, and then I waited, and then all of a sudden it opened up, right? As you change, the Gita may change for you as well. And I can only tell you from my own personal experience how it has changed me from the earliest periods of my exposure to it. I began. It has to do with one of the main things that I do, which is writing. And as a writer, every writer at this literary festival will tell you that to become a successful writer, you have to fail, and you have to fail numerous times, and you will get tons of rejection letters. And those rejection letters break people. When a lot of writers who are aspiring writers will get rejected a few times, and they will lose their confidence. They will despair. They will throw down their bow and arrow, figuratively speaking, right? and they will stop writing, they'll never go back to it. And as a writer, someone starting out, and as even now, to this day, I still get rejections all the time. It doesn't faze me. I power through it, and it doesn't cause those feelings of despair, giving up, hopelessness, or anything like that. And it's sustained me as a writer to this point where I get to speak to you here in Jaipur, right? And that's because it has taught me not to focus on whether or not I'm going to get invited to a literary festival in 2019, but to focus on the words themselves, on the art itself, on every last line, every poem, and every word that I'm putting into that poem, every chapter in that novel, just the next sentence, the next line, and staying in the moment that way, and doing my work.
And yeah, that is, of course, the core message of the Gita is to do your duty, the work that you need to do without regard to the fruits of it. But a problem I've had with the Gita in the past is the notion that in doing that, you're instructed to follow your swadharma, which I think, how do you translate that? So it's the dharma proper to you. So each person has their own particular dharma. And that's usually associated, particularly within the Indian tradition, with a kind of birth-given position, a birth-given dharma. That's often how it's understood. And of course, we nowadays, life is much more complicated than that. We are not born into doing particular things in our lives. So now I know what my swadharma is. For 5 years, I've had a job at a university finally, and my swadharma now is to teach my students, publish research, and come and disseminate things and so forth. So I know what I'm meant to do. But I was quite old by the time I found my swadharma, and I spent many years in the wilderness, sort of wandering around, wondering what the hell am I meant to do in this life, and trying various different things. So what do you have to say about that aspect of it?
Sure. Yeah, and I think my understanding of this is that there's a way that we read about societies and the way societies are portrayed in writing, and then there's the way that life really is. And so, if someone were to give you a verbal description of how ancient Vedic India used to be, or ancient India used to be, everyone would be in their particular castes. Those castes would have subcastes, and everybody would then be born in it, and simply all the way down the line, it would be a perfectly static society. It's called, anthropologists call it a static society. And there would be, everyone would just be born knowing exactly what they should do. But even in those societies, if you look at the Gita itself, Arjuna, he's a prince. He's been a prince, a kshatriya, since his birth. He's always known what to do. It's never been a question. And yet the Gita is triggered at a moment where he doesn't know what to do, and he can't bring himself to do what he's supposed to do. It's a sankat, it's a dharma sankat. He doesn't know what exactly he should be doing. But even before that, before the Kali Yuga, in the Treta Yuga, when Sri Ram has this instance in the Uttarkand that we were talking about earlier, he knows who he is. He's a king. He's never had any doubt about that himself. And yet he too has a moment where he doesn't know the right action, and he has to anguish over it. And when he makes his decision, there's every sign that he regrets it. At the end, he's urged to remarry. Kings used to have many, many wives back then, including his own father. It's only Sita, to the point where in the final scenes where he's having this large-scale sacrifice or ceremony, and he needs to have a queen next to him. He has a golden statue of Sita because he misses her so much, right? And so it's reassuring to me to know that even in these ancient times, even in a yuga before ours, people had trouble knowing exactly what to do. And that's because, as Krishna says in the Gita, gahana karmano gati, right? The way of action is profound. And even poets are confused. He uses this term kavi in that context, because Hinduism, as you know, has a very, very prominent role for poets from the very beginning. And they were regarded not just as poets, but as true knowers, not just as makers of verses, but thinkers of ideas. And so the way of action is profound, and the dharma itself is protean. The dharma itself is difficult to always know what the truly dharmic action is. And that's part of being human. That's part of the game. You know, that's part of the game that we're in. That's sort of the network, the test that we are being given at every moment of our lives as we pursue our yoga, pursue our reunification with the divine, I think.
Thank you. Well, I think we do have time for my afraid historical contextual question, and then we'll open it up to the audience a bit. Sure. So I'll just, I'll explain how I see that the Gita coming at a period, around about 2,000 years ago, when in fact it's part of a resurgence of Vedic traditions. In fact, that's one of the messages it's giving. It's trying to it's trying to provide a template of action and behavior for a Hindu society on the back of the Mauryans, in which Buddhism was the state religion. Yeah. So we had a period in which these renouncer traditions, so ascetics who renounced the world, which is the focus of my research and what the sort of the center of my studies. So when I look at the Gita, and a lot of texts, I'm afraid I'm probably slightly cherry picking, and I look at the bits that are of relevance to what of interest to me. And so I think that not only is the Gita giving us kind of manifesto, a blueprint for how to live in this Hindu society, it's also to some extent rejecting these renouncer traditions. And there's one particular verse that I always remember, Anashritaha karma phalam, I always remember, Anashritaha karma phalam karyam karma karoti yaha sasanyasi cha yogi cha na niragnir na cha kriyaha. So that means that he who performs his duty without regard for the fruit, as we've been talking about already, he is a sannyasi, he is a renouncer, he is a yogi, not the person who gives up ritual actions or abandons the sacred fire. Okay, so because there's this notion of the renouncer, the sannyasi, is the one who gives up the usual rituals of the tradition. So to me, that seems to be the statement there is that Krishna is saying you don't need to go off to the forest and give up all the usual daily rituals and your God-given dharma, your birth-given dharma in order to be a renouncer. You can do it just by carrying out your duty and without regard to the rewards of that. Now, we did discuss this briefly earlier, and I think you had a nice answer, because I think it's probably partly, but you can expand on this, it's partly my cherry picking and only looking at those relevant bits, and perhaps it's explained elsewhere within the text, which you've lived with much more closely than I have.
Right, and that's a wonderful point that you bring up about like cherry picking, which is that one thing I've noticed about the Gita is that it's many things at once, and it advises many things at once. So when he's talking about karma yoga, then at that moment, karma yoga is supreme, bhakti yoga is supreme, right? And the way Krishna structures the Gita is that he says, he wants everyone to find their own path and their own way back to Brahman, right? And I think that there's even verses in the Gita where he talks about, and you can cherry pick this one, for your purposes, you could say that there's a verse where he talks about, to one who truly knows the Vedas are as useful as a well when water is flooding in from all sides, right? And that would imply a transcendence of the Vedic tradition, right? Giving up those rituals, and there's actually in the second adhyaya also, he actually has a point where he criticizes ritual, empty ritualistic action. He talks about how these people are just after glut and grandeur, a very self-aggrandizing way of looking at it. And I think that the Gita, I believe at least, has something for everyone and something for every temperament, right? So your temperament may send you down the path of renunciation, the type of sannyas that you're talking about. Someone else's who's maybe perhaps more emotional, perhaps a musician like Mirabai, they're going to be drawn towards Bhakti Yoga, right? And you can go down the line of each path of the Hindu way. And you don't have to travel down all of them at the same time. And it's not as though one invalidates the other, at least in my opinion. Now, having said that, I come from the opposite school of thought as far as historical contextualizing of the Gita. I have very little interest in that aspect of it, although I very much admire the work that scholars do in that regard. We were talking earlier about how there's sort of like a 300-year range where people try and date the Gita, and I think to myself, well, that's like something that includes Alexander Pope and T.S. Eliot in the same range, and it's almost as though that has such a broad application. It's so indistinct that I really don't have that much of a draw to it. I have always regarded the Gita as something that I'm trying to understand and apply to my life and self-transfigure through, and self-transfigure by understanding, self-transfigure by reading. And so whether it was written by someone in response to Maurya Buddhist domination of India, whether it was written by Vyasa or some other sage earlier than that and inserted into the Mahabharata, or whether it was sung by Krishna and transcribed in real time. To my mind, all of those things are subsumed in the one larger metaphysical truth, core truth of the Bhagavad Gita, which is that the Atma, my Atma, your Atma, and Brahman are actually fundamentally all one. And so regardless of all those options that we gave, it has one origin. The Gita has one origin. That origin is within timelessness, all right? Within something that is outside of the flow of history. And I think that in the Hindu tradition, the clue to this idea comes in the name of Vyasa, all right? Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, right? So the poet of the Mahabharata, and by implication, the one who is said to have, written, whose part of his work is the Gita. Part of the Gita is part of the Mahabharata. It's Krishna writing Krishna, because it's a clue. I think of that as a clue. This is, of course, my own speculation. But metaphysically, I believe that no matter, you could come back to me next year and say, hey, Amit, they've solved the puzzle. It was this one guy, right? And I would still say, okay, great, you have his photograph or something, or you have his DNA or something, or his bones. It doesn't matter. It was still divine. It was still written and transmitted to us, and its origin is divine.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good point on which for us to end our discussion. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. We've got one in the front here, please.
Yeah, my question is, there are 300, more than 300 versions of the Ramayana extant. That was the subject of a famous essay. So now, when you've written a book on Sita, so what was your source material? For example, in the Buddhist and Jain traditions, Rama is considered a mortal, whereas in Hindu devotional aspect, it's the Vaishnavite versions. Vaishnavite versions which reign supreme, where Lord Rama is a god.
Right.
And the second question to James would be, as in you mentioned that Gita is dated around 2,000 years ago. So according to some devotional traditions, the Kali Yuga, when the 3112 BC or something, that is the time where Bhagavad Gita was spoken. And historically, when Alexander invaded India, the Greeks have mentioned that they found sculptures of Vasudeva, which is Krishna. So how have, as in Western sources, managed to ascribe a date to the Gita? That's my question.
Oh, sure. I'll answer mine real quick. I think I mentioned earlier. There's it's a mountain range of different Ramayanas. For me, the ones that I personally read when I was much younger were Valmiki, Kampan, Irama Avtaram, which is a Tamil version, and then Tulsidasa's, which is the Avadi Hindi, which is one of my favorites. It's just a joy to recite. And those are the main ones that I did. And I'm sure that when I was a kid, there was the Ramanand Sagar series on television, and that's always been in the back of my head at some point because.
Amar Chitra Katha as well, perhaps?
No, I think it was mostly the television serial which I watched when I was a kid. So, you go ahead.
Well, I'm slightly quaking because I'm no expert, and the Sanskrit literature is huge, of course, and I'm not a specialist on that period, all those texts. So, of course, one's generally standing on the shoulders of giants, or perhaps not, who have previously attempted to date these things. I mean, in terms of 3102 is not BC is normally given as the date of the start of Kali Yuga, and therefore the Great War in the Mahabharata. But I think most people are agreed that if we're going to look at it historically and not as a divine revelation, then that's probably not going to wash. You mentioned the Greeks and statues of Vasudeva. I think just because there's a statue of Vasudeva doesn't mean that must post-date the composition of the Gita. Now, the Gita, of course, is part of the Mahabharata, and there is a general consensus amongst scholars that the Mahabharata was compiled or composed. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the process of its formation, in particular whether it's layered, and that's a rather hot topic at the moment. But I work very closely with texts. I'm forever reading texts, and the much later texts that I work with often are layered, and it's very clear. We can see that, in one manuscript you have the text in a shorter form, and then in another manuscript other verses have been added, so you can see later layers. But I don't want to engage in that debate concerning the Mahabharata. What I will say, I think amongst scholars who deal with it, they generally put the Mahabharata, give it a long period of composition between 300 BC and 300 AD, CE, and the Gita comes as probably in the later part of that. But you'd have to consult those scholars' work rather than mine. There's too many. I have a slight problem as one of the few kind of academic Sanskritists here. I'm expected to know everything about every Sanskrit text that was ever written, and I don't. It's a bit like expecting someone who knows English to know everything about every English text that was ever written.
Thank you, Pranam. So as a Hindu myself who was not born into the Hindu tradition, but who later kind of came into the tradition, the question of birth and adhikaritvam has been one that, I frequently encounter. So verses such as one in the Bhagavad Gita, the 4th adhyaya, the 13th shloka, Chaturvarnyam mayam srishtam guna karma vibhagashaha. So the ones where the 4 divisions of what you're to do in life is to be decided based on your gunas, your own internal kind of character, constitution, as well as, whatever karma, whatever work you pursue in life, that is what kind of decides the direction that you're to take, and your adhikaritvam, your, whether it's appropriate for you to do so, and how that kind of constitutes the swadharma that we were talking about earlier. And then in one of the, I think it was Chandogya Upanishad with Satyakama and Jabala, where one person was initiated essentially to study the Vedas, even though he wasn't sure of his parentage. How do you think those instances in Shruti and in Gita, kind of how are they to be contextualized in the rest of?
No, well, first of all, welcome. And I think that one of the great things about the vastness of Hindu scriptures is the fact that it has a certain, there's a certain amount of volition in what you choose to focus on and what you choose to ignore, okay? And holds true in practice of the so-called revealed scriptures of, say, the Quran or the Bible. People in practice actually focus on certain verses, and they make those their life verses, and those are their life guides, and they ignore the stuff about slaying infidels. And I love that about people, right? And so as far as lived faith is concerned, you follow your heart and you find those verses that resonate with your soul and that draw you upward, right? And there may be some chaff, for you, all right, over here about, hey, you have to be born like this, and you're supposed to do this, and you're supposed to do that. That's chaff for you. That's not speaking to your Atma. It's not speaking to who you are or who you're going to become, all right? And it's not speaking to where you're headed, which I believe, and I wish you the best, is the same place I'm headed, which is Brahman, right? So, God bless you.
Okay, hi. My name is Leher, and I was struck by two things. One of them that you mentioned, that whenever I feel like putting down my bow and arrow and giving up writing, there is that one shloka in the Gita, Hatova prapsi swargam jitva bhokshese mahim, tasma uthishta konteya yuddhaya krita nishchaya, which is the one that when Arjun says that I'm just, what is this supposed to be? Why am I going to slaughter my own kin? And then Lord Krishna says to him that Hatova, either you'll attain swargam, or if you live, you'll attain the world. Either way is lift yourself up, Konteya.
Right.
So I really appreciate your bringing that into the context of writing, because as a person who has been trying to write for a while, it's a very beautiful interpretation of the Gita. The second part was, I had since both of you mentioned the Gita means different things to different people, I had a little perspective on it. I think even in terms of time in life, like when I read it as a teenager, I wanted to go to the Himalayas. I read the 7 Upanishads, and the Gita was about spirituality, and Hermann Hesse kind of connected. When in my 20s and early 30s, it was about guiding you in your life. So, okay, so that's one perspective. The last thing I wanted to say is, have you worked on the Upanishads at all? That was it. Any of you?
No, I have not translated the Upanishads. My center has been the Gita for the past 10 years, and I've actually begun translating it again. And in the future, you will see another translation of the Gita from me that will not replicate a single line. It's going to be into alliterative verse this next time, and it will have its own new commentary. So I use translation, the act of translation, to understand my text in this particular scripture better. And the Gita, so I have not exhausted the Gita, and the Gita being inexhaustible, this implies that I'll be translating it for the rest of my life. So.
Okay, we've probably got time for one, maybe two, if they're quick.
Why is it said or understood that Gita is like given from somebody down to us?
There's a verse.
Why?
There's a verse. I forget exactly where it is. Oh, why is it said that the Gita is given?
Why can't it be a simple person who was so enlightened that with special ability he could deduce so much? He was a normal person who rose to great thoughts. A normal person, not somebody from upstairs giving to us downstairs. Is it or is it not?
I think in the Gita at one point he says that he gave it to Vivasvat, and then Vivasvat gave it to Manu, and then Manu gave it to Krishna. But then Arjuna says that he asks Krishna back, well, how can you have given it to yourself through this lineage? And so Krishna, explains his true nature, which is that he is in fact divine. So your assertion that Krishna was just a regular guy with great thoughts was something that probably some people might disagree with. I suspect. I disagree with it.
I guess that's the academic understanding, isn't it? Yeah. That's the scholarly understanding that this is a human creation.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
sure.
I think many a religious person might disagree with that baseline assumption. And next question.
I have to be very quick. We've only got half a minute.
Half a minute. All right, I think we're
Okay, well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
listening. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you.
A big round of applause to Amit Majmudar and James Mallinson for this fascinating session. But please don't go away. I just want to thank you. You've been attending these sessions and sessions conducted beautifully without any glitch. The sound was perfect. The video was perfect. So I want to thank